Good morning, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Advanced Training Principles, HSC3201. Today we're going to just go over a brief summary of the sort of adaptations that various training methods are expected to bring about, and hence why we actually do the training. So again, I'll just go on again. We'll have a look at share screen. We'll just take you through the various slides and have a quick chat about each of them. So we should be now looking at, there we go, and we are, our first slide, and we're looking at advanced training principles and exercise prescription. Half and triplet, they're our predominant reference that we will be using throughout today's lecture. So we look at it, when we think of physiological changes or any changes in the purpose of training, they're going to impact on every system within the body. So we're going to look at the muscular system, the cardio, the respiratory system, tissue level, and all that. And a lot of it's going to depend on the type of training, frequency of the training, and the intensity of that training. And hopefully what we will endeavour to bring about is an appropriate response. So what I'd like you to look at now is, we'll go through and what sort of things we're going to look at. So with the training effects that we talk about, we're looking at the biochemical changes, and that's at the tissue level. So when we go right into that very basic cell position, we're talking about those changes, and we're looking at changes in the biochemicals at various things from your lactate, from your hydrogen ions, ATP, PC production and expenditure. Blood changes, and we're looking at some of these can be considered more health rather than exercise performance. Your body composition changes, of course, will increase muscle mass, reduce body fat, increase respiratory type. Systems changes, again, we're looking at neural systems such as your brainwave, and think of it as the coordination patterns that we require to do it, that we're training the brain how to engage the muscle at the appropriate time. Cardiovascular, and that's talking about enhancing the heart. We seem to forget about it. Now, when we look at it, we've got a range of different training things that we're going to have to apply throughout a calendar year, whether it be an elite athlete or a recreational athlete. And the sort of changes we're looking at is our cardiovascular, which is the heart and supplying blood, which inadvertently supplies oxygen to the working muscles. We're going to look at anaerobic. So the difference is that cardiovascular training, we're looking at endurance. Anaerobic is at high intensity. Then we're going to have a look at things such as strength and power training. And we're going to use, at this stage, we're talking generically about strength and power, but think of this, it can include absolute strength. We can look at power, we can look at endurance, we can look at explosiveness. So it's a general term that means more than just that in the way we're going to be using it. And then we also have to look at recovery and detraining. And that's probably one thing where we don't put a lot of effort into and a lot of thought into is how we program recovery and detraining. Recovery is getting sufficient recovery to allow for adaptation to occur before the next session, and detraining is the effects that if we don't expose the body to a stimulus, we will lose it. You know, the old adage, if you don't use it, you lose it. So if we look at cardiovascular training adaptations, it's all about endurance performance, sustaining the highest energy output for as long as the time requires. And to look at that, we can have a look at these main 6 points where we're looking at our aerobic capacity, your oxygen capacity, economy of movement, also with the improved aerobic capacity and the oxygen capacity of the economy, you get a lower expenditure for doing the same amount of work. Your anaerobic threshold, that's where you can maintain the highest output before you break into anaerobic energy systems. So think of it, although it's called anaerobic threshold, think of it as the highest amount of work you can perform. And that leads us to our highest sustainable output. And the sort of things we're looking at, the adaptations, increasing myoglobin. Now we understand hemoglobin, that's what carries oxygen throughout the blood to delivery from the respiratory system to the working muscle. Myoglobin is the chemical or the hormone that transfers oxygen from the blood into the working tissue or into the mitochondria. Oxidation of glycogen, or about how we can produce through aerobically, we can produce or increase our ATP. And oxidation of fat. So the more aerobic and more endurance we're trained, then the more use of fat as a fuel substrate will become. So if we're looking at general populations, that's quite a sought after possibility. But with our elite athletes at various times, we need them to be able to use that fat as well. Some of the cardiovascular changes that we're going to look for is, well, first of all, your max heart rate isn't going to change. That's set by your age. And our training doesn't make you younger, doesn't make you older. So your max heart rate will remain unchanged. In fact, it'll decrease over time because you get older. Increased stroke volume and increased cardiac output. Well, increased stroke volume is, think of it, each rep of the heart beating is going to be able to force out more blood. And with that, cardiac output will increase. Heart size, it can be increased through left ventricular hypertrophy, or the ventricle, or myocardial thickness, the thickness of the muscle wall, and a decreased heart rate. If you look at our high-level elite endurance trained athletes, whether they be, say, a cyclist or a endurance runner, they're going to have resting heart rates of way down below 50, down to as low as possibly 40 beats per minute. Now, with the changes, we come a greater capacity for oxygen carrying. So the more oxygen you can carry, the more fuel that can be delivered to the muscle for working. Increased capillary density. The capillaries are the smallest end of the arterial chain, where blood is actually an oxygen and is to the working muscles. So if we have a greater density of capillaries, then we're going to be able to deliver more blood, more oxygen, more fuel as such to the working muscle tissue. Lactic acid accumulation, whether it be through lactate or through hydrogen ions, it allows the clearance of waste products. So think of it as a buffering system. And the more aerobically we are trained, then the greater the body is trained in reducing this lactate accumulation. And this all leads to, with our VO2 max, as a greater delivery of oxygen through blood volume, hemoglobin, capillary density, a greater capacity for the muscles to actually take up oxygen, and increasing mitochondrial density, glycogen and fat oxidation with lactate threshold. All of these bring about advances in your cardiovascular or your endurance capacity. So many sports and the necessity for cardiovascular training, although a lot of sports primarily have a lot of anaerobic type work, the higher aerobic conditioning for team sports, and that allows for a quicker recovery between work intervals. Also, before we do generally advance into anaerobic conditioning, we need to have that solid aerobic base. But when we do look at our training for our team sport athletes, or those sports that have high anaerobic capacity, and although we need this aerobic conditioning, we can't apply it to the detriment of anaerobic activities or anaerobic performance. And one of the conditionings we can do is long, slow distance, low intensity training, or high intensity training. You know, that's when we get to our intervals, our fartlek, our HIIT, high intensity interval training, and those sorts of things. Both of them will enhance aerobic capacity. Now, in team sports, we can enhance the aerobic capacity through our high intensity interval type work, and it benefits the anaerobic performance in that team sport. As opposed to, if you're a middle distance runner, they may stick to more the endurance type, although we'll do threshold training anyway. Some of the anaerobic conditions that will come about is increased capacity of our ATP-PC fuel system and glycolytic capacity. So in other words, those anaerobic energy systems, that's what we're looking to change and improve. Excuse me. Because anaerobic is those first two fuel systems. The ATP-PC comes out at around, within the first 10 seconds, we're usually exhausted. Our lactate or alactic or glycolytic capacity, it'll take us out anywhere from 40 to 60 seconds. And that's what we're looking for our anaerobic changes. They're the primary. Now, they do have benefits with increasing VO2 max and aerobic capacity to some extent, but when we do anaerobic training, it is to bring about benefits in this. So, of course, everyone's familiar with it these days, high intensity interval type work. It requires ATP, and then you need to apply sufficient recovery to restore the ATP. Characteristics of the training program will deliver the benefits and the changes. So if you do high intensity interval training, the improvements will come out. Say if you're doing 20-meter sprint repeats with a rest period of what would be equivalent to 1 to 5, work for 1 interval, rest for 5 intervals, then your anaerobic performance will be enhanced for performing that. So when we talk about competitive sport, it's a complex interaction between these energy systems, and we highlight how each of them contribute to that sort of performance. So we need to look at that and understand that and apply it, how we can work with across the 3 energy systems with improving performance. Because although we may sit there and look at, it's an anaerobic event, it still has other components along those lines. Now, some of the physiological adaptations that we're sort of looking at are the nervous system and muscular system, the connective tissue, the endocrine, and the cardiovascular system. This is where our anaerobic adaptation is taking place. Now, the neural adaptation is talking about training our muscles for speed and power. Speed, power, in other words, that rapid explosive contraction. I was talking about neural recruitment. So in other words, the brain or the central nervous system firing off a signal to recruit the maximum amount of motor units or muscle activation within the select muscle group. Adaptations or long-term that come with the neuromuscular system includes training with the muscle recruitment, improved neural firing rates, or in other words, sending out those signals, synchronization and timing, so our coordination patterns, and a reduction in inhibitory mechanisms. In previous subjects, you would have heard of things about the stretch reflex and the Golgi tendon. If the muscle is taken beyond a point, whether it's force development or length, that the body isn't used to, the body's safety systems or inhibitory systems will engage through risk of injury. Through training, we take those muscles beyond that force development, beyond that rate of muscle lengthening, so the body gets exposed to it and will remember and will basically be programmed that the muscle can develop this much force without an injury, so we can delay that inhibitory mechanism engaging and disengaging the contraction. And these all occur prior to structural changes. So these changes are occurring. Think of them as the neural changes. Well, that's why it's neural adaptation, of course. These are our initial changes. Think of it as when you first started a weightlifting program 1,000 years ago. The first time you lift a weight, you feel quite weak, and within a few weeks, your strength rapidly increases, and that's just the neural adaptation. In other words, the body's starting to engage more muscles, it's recruiting them in the appropriate sequence, and it's engaging the required muscles without bringing in other muscles. And so that's what we're looking at for the initial changes to occur. Now, the muscular adaptations, we're looking at increases in size and FIPE and TIBA transitions, so we can convert type 1 to type 2. It's only temporary and it will revert back. Plus biochemical and ultrastructural components, such as substrate concentrations, the architect of the muscle, bigger, stronger, and the enzyme activity. And what we look for with most of it is it's exposing the body to let it know what it can deal with and to train it how to deal with it more effectively. Now, our connective tissues, which includes the bone, the tendons, the ligaments, the fascia, and the cartilage. Now, they all impart mechanical force. They're all part of this muscular system, or the skeletal muscular system. And they're all part of this delivering our sporting performance. Now, we focus on muscles, but we're also dealing with the bone and the tendons. We're increasing the bone density. We're increasing the strength and the ability of the tendons, the ligaments, the fascia. Especially with fascia, it's controlling and directing power throughout the muscular system, and the cartilage. Now, all of these are benefits that we do require both for sporting performance and for general health. And these are the basic connective tissue responses that will occur. Now, our endocrine system, we're talking about hormones more Now, particularly if we have a look at these, the testosterone and the cortisol, they're our anabolic and catabolic hormones. These two work in unison. Testosterone is, of course, the anabolic hormone, which creates an environment to grow muscle. Cortisol is considered a stress hormone, so both physical and psychological stress, but it creates a catabolic. These two generally work in unison together, and we measure over training through the ratio between testosterone and cortisol. Now, that's a long-term plan. The acute fluctuation, in other words, sometimes when cortisol increases after a bout, that's not necessarily a negative consequence, and that does occur, and the body's response to restore homeostasis is to increase testosterone production. Plus also, we can also get changes in our growth hormone all through anaerobic training. Hydrogen ion accumulation influencing growth hormone and cortisol release, and the changes in these resting hormone concentrations are unlikely to be affected by anaerobic conditioning. Now, our cardiovascular adaptation, which we previously spoke about in aerobic, but in anaerobic, heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, and blood pressure are all improved through anaerobic. So heart rate, in other words, heart rate. Again, it's the heart's a muscle. The more you train it, the stronger it is. The stronger it gets, the more blood it can pump with each contraction. So with that, it can meet the demands quicker because it's pumping more out. Now, if our heart rate's stronger, then our stroke volume, how much blood we push out each time, is going to increase. And therefore, our cardiac output with improved heart rate and increased stroke volume will be enhanced. And then blood pressure, it's a beneficial effect of blood pressure that it actually engages the elasticity of the vessels. So it has a beneficial effect on reducing our blood pressure. Resistance training, why do we do it? Now, I like to tell people it's because life's a competition. Whoever lifts the most when you die wins. But basically, we're looking at our muscle force production, specifically when we're talking. So when we talk resistance training, we can refer to it as strength, as power, endurance, functional training. And it's about training our muscles to produce a force and to move a load, which will generate the adaptation, whether it be the force velocity curve, the capacity to do continual work, and a change in the structure. And you lift weights, you get big, which is, just remember, because girls get the girls, apparently. Now, the effects of improving through resistance training through athletic performance: stronger, powerful, or greater muscular endurance. Depending on the type of sport, we need to have some sort of element to it. If you have a highly explosive sport, say if we look at perhaps one of the combat sports, whether it be judo, taekwondo, or sumo wrestling either, they're very explosive and they have very limited endurance requirements. So for them, what they're looking for is the type of training where we produce a lot of force rapidly. Endurance is not so much essential. If you look at sumo wrestling, for one, it only lasts for 3 or 4 seconds. And the requirement to go beyond that is not relevant. So we don't necessarily require a lot of endurance training for that sport. But we need to also train the muscles. We will do endurance in off-season because we like to put down that base, but when it gets very much closer to sport specific, we need it to understand that it is relative to that sport. So we got this prevention and rehab of injuries. Now, there is a lot of prehab type work. The science is still out. We still will do it, but we still have this problem with injuries. And the biggest problem we have with doing preventative work to stop injuries is injuries are multifaceted. The mechanisms of injury will vary and change from injury type to individual athletes. Rehab of injuries, yes, quite often we want to resynchronize the motor units and get the muscles acting and performing in a coordinated pattern. General fitness. And improve functional capacity and performance of ADLs. ADLs is active daily living. So this is our normal day-to-day events. So athletic performance, yes, but it's also required for general populations. So it's just like the old lady who wants to pick up a grandkid. That's why you get 60, 70-year-old ladies doing deadlifts. They're not doing 300-kilo deadlifts, but they're doing a deadlift because they want to bend down and be able to pick up their grandchild. Or they want to be able to reach and put the groceries away. Get out in the garden. Even office workers, getting their functional capacity and getting them be able to do their day-to-day activities. So it's a requirement for everyone. Response to our resistance training. Okay, you need overload. So in other words, you need to do a little bit more each week. Specificity with resistance training. If you're working on the chest will get stronger, bigger, powerful. It's not going to have a transfer to the legs. Variation, we need to do vary. We need to shock the system, but also mentally. Not everyone enjoys doing the same thing week in, week out. And individuality, because we talk about the basic fundamentals and foundations of any sort of training program, but they're the fundamentals. You're going to have to learn to adapt and tweak with individual athletes, which makes it complex if you're working with a squad of, say, 25 to 30 footballers with varying positions and varying training history, varying adaptation approaches, that you need to be able to identify what works with each of the athletes. And we look at our neural, structural, and metabolic. Neural, central nervous system. Structural, we're looking at the muscular, skeletal, muscular, and the metabolic, we're talking about the biochemical responses. And with everything, we need our overload, our variation, and our specificity. Now that's resistance training, anaerobic training, aerobic training. It doesn't matter. We need to apply overload, a little bit more variation and specificity. We don't want to change everything because then we can't monitor the improvement. So as you see, this is the optimal amount that we need to obtain that overlap period. So overload is simple. Oops, we went one too many. Overload, we can increase it, whether it be time, reps, load, rest periods, any sort of concept, as long as we are putting a greater stress and a little bit more than last time. Specificity, the type of contraction, type of muscles, the movement, and the speed. So if you have an endurance sport, sometimes you will do power work, but you will also center upon endurance. Whereas people requiring speed and power, they will focus most of their training on speed and power. Now when we look at that, our resistance training, neural adaptation, so that's all about the coordination patterns. Structural adaptation, hypertrophy or the cross-sectional area. Hypertrophy is increasing the size of the muscle. Hyperplasia is when a muscle fiber is torn, damages, and breaks, and you end up with a greater amount of muscle fibers. They're the two main structural adaptations that can or do occur. Now our training guidelines, and these are going to vary with everything. A training guideline is just that, it's a guideline. You stick to the fundamentals, and then as you get used to your particular athletes, you can apply slight variations and you tweak them to suit. So guidelines off season, 4 to 6 weeks, 4 to 6 times per week. This is when in most sports they do most of their resistance training, high volume, high loads, because they're not playing. Pre-season, we start looking at getting more sport specific. The off season would generally be increased strength and hypertrophy. So high volume. Pre-season, you start looking at whether or not we need to change it from endurance to more strength power. In season, we talk about this concept of maintenance. So it's only 1 to 2 sessions per week. And it's going to depend if you have a fluctuating playing calendar. You have a 4-day turnaround between games, or you have a 10-day turnaround. You can play with the variables there to adjust that. And then in our post-season, this is when they're doing their optimum recovery component. And what we need to think about with that is the first 4 weeks, if they've got injuries, get them fixed. Do they need to go under the knife, or do they need to have a rehab? We don't want them in 3 months still with the same injury. At the elite level, no problems. It's the sub-elite level where most people will start working. It becomes problematic to really focus on these guys to do this. So post-season, then we look at going in just endurance training. It's about maintaining the muscle without stressing it. It needs a chance to recover. Now with our endurance in that off-season, again, 5 to 6 times per week. Long duration, low to moderate intensity. Pre-season, moderate to long duration, and intensity increases. In season, 5 to 6 sessions. Short, low training, high for racing. So the intensity increases, the volume decreases. And post-season, again, usually, say if they're doing a lot of running in that, we'll go, okay, maybe you need to get away from that, have a break, go do some cycling or swimming. If you're a swimmer who's been doing swimming in the first 4 weeks, maybe we get them out more ground or body weight activities. So they might be running, they might be riding, they might be doing weights. So there's an understanding of what time of the season it is and what our requirements are. Now, this is a basic one. Getting to the reading, guys, you are going to have to follow these sorts of guidelines when you start applying for your part 3 and 4 assessments. Okay. Drop me an email if you have any problems. If not, I will see you all very shortly for week 3 in advanced training principles. In the meantime, guys, let me know if you do have any issues with your training. Sorry, not your training. If you do have any issues with your assessments and keeping up with the coursework. Until then, guys, all the best and keep going. All right. See you next week.